A lie spoken under oath can fool a courtroom, but it can never outrun the truth that has been waiting in silence. The courtroom in Richmond, Virginia, had fallen into the kind of silence that made every breath feel too loud. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows, stretching across polished wooden floors where decades of verdicts had been delivered, lives had been broken, and justice had not always worn an honest face. 12 jurors watched without blinking. Reporters held their pens in midair. Even the judge seemed unusually still. Officer Daniel Brooks stood in the witness box with the confidence of a man who had never expected to lose. His navy blue uniform was perfectly pressed. His silver badge reflected the morning light. His expression carried the practiced calm of someone who had repeated the same story enough times to mistake it for the truth. He rested one hand on the Bible, the other gripping the edge of the stand as if the courtroom itself belonged to him. Across the room sat Vanessa Carter. She wore a charcoal gray suit with no jewelry except a simple silver watch. Her natural curls were tied neatly behind her head. Her posture was straight, her hands folded quietly in her lap, and her face revealed nothing beyond quiet patience. To everyone else, she looked like another black woman trapped inside a system that had already decided who deserved to be believed. Daniel glanced at her for only a second before turning back toward the prosecutor. "Did the defendant resist your lawful commands?" the prosecutor asked. Daniel answered without hesitation. She became aggressive. She attempted to interfere with an active investigation and threatened officers at the scene. His voice was steady. Convincing. Every sentence sounded polished enough to erase what had really happened. Several jurors nodded almost instinctively. Someone in the gallery quietly whispered, "That's probably the end of her." Vanessa never reacted. She simply looked at Daniel as though she were listening to someone read from a script she had already memorized. The prosecutor continued. "So your report accurately reflects everything that occurred?" "Every single word," Daniel replied. Not a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Not a pause. Not a single crack in the performance. The judge adjusted his glasses before making a note. From the outside, it looked like another ordinary trial. A respected white police officer. A black woman accused of obstructing justice. The scales already leaning long before the verdict. Outside, rain clouds gathered over the courthouse, turning the afternoon sky into a dull sheet of gray. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance, unnoticed by the people inside. The old building seemed to grow heavier with every false sentence spoken beneath its roof. Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly. Not in defeat. Not in fear. Almost as if she were counting. 1 sentence. 2. 3. Every word Daniel spoke settled quietly into the record. Every lie found its place. Every oath became another thread in a web he could no longer see. Daniel believed he was burying the woman sitting across from him. He believed the badge on his chest still carried more weight than her voice. He believed that once this testimony ended, another complaint against another black citizen would disappear into a forgotten archive, just like so many before it. What he never noticed was the older man seated quietly in the last row of the courtroom. He never noticed the young woman typing every word with unusual precision. He never noticed the brief exchange of glances between two strangers near the exit. And he certainly never noticed that Vanessa Carter had not asked a single question since the trial began. She didn't need to. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has already learned everything they came to prove. And before this day was over, Daniel Brooks would discover that the witness he thought he had destroyed had walked into that courtroom carrying something far more powerful than an accusation. She had walked in carrying the truth. The silence that settled after Daniel Brooks finished his testimony felt strangely permanent, as though the courtroom itself had accepted his version of reality without asking a single question. The judge made another note. The prosecutor organized his files with quiet satisfaction. Somewhere near the back, a camera shutter clicked before immediately falling silent again. Vanessa Carter remained exactly where she had been since the hearing began. She neither objected nor whispered to her attorney. She simply watched. To many inside that room, her silence looked like surrender. It wasn't. Outside the courthouse, the first drops of rain finally reached the stone steps, darkening the concrete one spot at a time. The storm that had threatened all morning was arriving with deliberate patience, wrapping the old government building in gray shadows that blurred the city skyline. Inside, the atmosphere felt just as heavy. The prosecutor approached the center of the courtroom with measured confidence. "Your Honor," he said, "Officer Brooks has served this department for 14 years with distinction. His reports have consistently demonstrated professionalism, integrity, and commitment to public safety." Several people nodded. Daniel lowered his eyes with practiced humility, pretending to be uncomfortable with the praise. It was a performance he had perfected years ago. Vanessa noticed every movement. The carefully timed sigh. The slight tightening of his jaw. Even the way he adjusted his wedding ring whenever difficult questions approached. She noticed details because details mattered. Truth often hid where pride believed no one was looking. Across the aisle, Vanessa's attorney quietly leaned toward her. "He's burying us," he whispered. She answered without moving her eyes. "Let him." The attorney frowned. He had represented clients for more than 20 years, but he had never seen anyone remain this calm while their entire reputation was being dismantled piece by piece. Witness after witness appeared to reinforce Daniel's version of events. A patrol officer claimed Vanessa had ignored lawful commands. Another officer insisted she had become hostile during questioning. Body language matched. Words aligned. Everything appeared almost rehearsed. The jury watched carefully. One juror folded his arms. Another slowly shook her head after hearing the testimony. The emotional tide inside the room continued moving against Vanessa. Imagine sitting there while strangers describe a version of you that never existed. Imagine hearing complete confidence wrapped around complete fiction. Imagine realizing that every calm breath you take is mistaken for weakness. Most people would interrupt. Most people would fight. Vanessa didn't. She quietly opened a small legal notebook resting on the defense table. She didn't write arguments. She didn't prepare emotional responses. Instead, she drew a single horizontal line across the page. Then another. Then another. Her attorney glanced down. "What are those?" "Timestamps," she answered softly. He looked confused. She closed the notebook before explaining anything further. At the witness stand, Daniel continued speaking with absolute certainty. "There was no bias involved," he declared. "Everything I did followed department policy." Those words echoed longer than the others. No bias. Department policy. Truth had a strange habit of remembering exact phrases. Near the courtroom entrance, an elderly court clerk quietly entered carrying a sealed envelope. She handed it to the bailiff without speaking and disappeared as quickly as she had arrived. Daniel never noticed. Neither did the prosecutor. But Vanessa did. Her eyes followed the envelope for only a fraction of a second before returning to the witness stand. The faintest hint of recognition crossed her face. Then it vanished. The judge announced a 15-minute recess. People immediately stood, stretching stiff legs and exchanging whispers across the room. Reporters hurried into the hallway. Jurors disappeared through a side door. Daniel smiled for the first time that morning. He believed the hardest part was over. He believed the jury had accepted every word he spoke beneath oath. As he stepped down from the witness stand, he walked past Vanessa with quiet confidence. Without stopping, he leaned just close enough for only her to hear. "You should have stayed out of police business." Vanessa slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. There was no anger. No fear. Only a calm that somehow made the hallway outside feel even quieter than before. Then she answered with 7 words that Daniel dismissed before he even understood them. "I've never Been outside police business, Officer Brooks. He smiled, assuming it was another empty attempt to sound brave. He kept walking. He had no idea that, for months, every confident step he had taken had been leading him toward this very courtroom, exactly where someone had intended him to be. The hallway outside courtroom 4 buzzed with low conversations, the muffled rhythm of polished shoes crossing marble floors, and the distant ringing of courthouse telephones that never seemed to stop. Lawyers gathered around coffee carts. Reporters rehearsed headlines before facts had fully settled. Deputies stood near the entrances with practiced expressions that revealed nothing. Only Vanessa Carter appeared completely untouched by the noise. She stood alone beside one of the tall windows overlooking the rain-soaked courthouse steps. Tiny droplets slid down the glass, distorting the people outside into blurred silhouettes rushing beneath umbrellas. She watched them for a moment before closing her eyes. Not to escape. To remember. Years earlier, another courthouse had looked remarkably similar. She had been much younger then, standing behind a federal prosecutor while watching a corruption case collapse because one police officer had lied with absolute confidence. Witnesses disappeared. Reports were rewritten. Cameras malfunctioned. By sunset, an innocent family had lost everything while those responsible walked out wearing badges that still gleamed in the afternoon sun. That day had changed her forever. She learned something few people ever understood. Lies rarely survive because they are convincing. They survive because everyone assumes someone else will challenge them. From that moment forward, Vanessa promised herself she would never confuse silence with surrender. A courthouse deputy interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Carter." She turned calmly. "The judge will resume in 10 minutes. Thank you. Nothing more. Nothing less." The deputy walked away, unaware that the woman he had just addressed carried herself with a discipline earned through years of work that almost no one in the building could imagine. Across the hallway, Daniel Brooks laughed quietly with 2 fellow officers. One clapped him on the shoulder. "You handled that perfectly." Daniel smiled. "Facts are easy to remember." The 3 men laughed. Vanessa heard every word. She simply looked away. Imagine hearing the person responsible for your humiliation celebrating before the truth has even been heard. Imagine knowing that every smile they share is built upon a lie. Most people would feel anger. Vanessa felt certainty. Because confidence built on deception usually lasts only until evidence enters the room. Inside the courtroom, jurors slowly returned to their seats. The judge adjusted his robe. The gallery filled once again with observers eager to witness what they believed would be a straightforward conclusion. Vanessa's attorney leaned toward her one last time. "I still don't understand why you never challenged his testimony." She looked toward the witness stand. "If someone is building a bridge with rotten wood," she said quietly, "you don't interrupt. You let them finish." He stared at her for a second. Then he slowly nodded, though he still didn't fully understand. Daniel resumed his seat with the relaxed posture of a man convinced victory was only minutes away. He casually glanced across the courtroom. Vanessa met his eyes. This time, something about her expression unsettled him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. As though she already knew how the story would end. The judge struck the gavel lightly. Court is back in session. The room became silent again. Outside, thunder rolled across the Richmond skyline. Inside, another sound quietly echoed through the courtroom. The bailiff placed the sealed envelope from earlier onto the clerk's desk. No announcement followed. No explanation was offered. Most people ignored it. Daniel certainly did. But Vanessa's gaze lingered on it for the briefest moment before returning to the judge. She took one slow breath. The waiting was almost over. For months, every report, every interview, every surveillance log, every recorded conversation, and every sworn statement had quietly pointed toward one man. The man now sitting comfortably beneath the protection of his badge. Daniel Brooks believed this trial was about proving a black woman had lied. He never realized that every answer he had given under oath was becoming evidence in a much larger investigation. And somewhere inside the growing stack of sealed federal files, his name had already been written in permanent ink. The prosecutor rose once again, confidence radiating from every measured step he took across the polished courtroom floor. His leather folder rested neatly beneath one arm, and a faint smile lingered on his face. To him, the trial was no longer a battle. It was a formality. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent room, "the evidence before you paints a simple picture." Officer Daniel Brooks responded to a dangerous situation exactly as his training required. The defendant chose confrontation over cooperation. He paused deliberately. And today, we have heard sworn testimony confirming exactly that. Several jurors shifted in their seats. The words sounded reasonable. Logical. Complete. That was the danger of a well-crafted lie. It rarely arrived looking like deception. It arrived dressed as certainty. Daniel sat comfortably beside the prosecution table, his hands folded neatly together. Every so often he nodded in agreement, careful not to appear overly eager. Years of wearing a badge had taught him that authority was often less about force than appearance. Control the room. Control the story. Control what people remember. Across the courtroom, Vanessa Carter remained perfectly still. She listened as photographs were displayed on large courtroom monitors. Still images from body cameras. Police reports. Signed statements. Timelines carefully arranged to support one conclusion. Everything looked convincing. Everything looked official. Everything looked exactly the way Daniel intended. Imagine sitting in that chair while pieces of paper slowly replace your voice. Imagine knowing the truth while strangers organize lies into neat exhibits. Imagine watching justice become a performance. Vanessa neither interrupted nor protested. Instead, her eyes moved quietly from one exhibit to the next. She wasn't studying the accusations. She was studying the mistakes. A timestamp that appeared slightly out of sequence. A photograph labeled with an incorrect report number. A witness signature written several hours before the interview supposedly occurred. Tiny details. Almost invisible. Yet truth often survives inside the smallest imperfections. Her attorney leaned closer. "They're overwhelming us." Vanessa answered without taking her eyes off the screen. "No. They're rushing." He looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means someone believes nobody will look closely." The attorney followed her gaze toward the evidence monitor. For the first time, he noticed what she had already seen. Small inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough to suggest that someone had been more interested in finishing the story than preserving the facts. Meanwhile, Daniel's confidence continued to grow. When the prosecutor asked another question, he answered instantly. No excessive force. No discrimination. No personal motive. Each denial sounded stronger than the last. The courtroom clerk continued typing. Every sentence entered permanently into the official record. Every answer became another sworn declaration. Daniel believed those words were protecting him. He never considered they might someday imprison him. Near the rear of the courtroom, two unfamiliar observers quietly exchanged a glance before returning their attention to the proceedings. Neither wore a police uniform. Neither spoke during the hearing. They simply watched with unusual patience, making occasional notes inside identical black notebooks. Daniel never looked in their direction. He didn't recognize them. He didn't think he needed to. Outside, the rain intensified, tapping steadily against the courthouse windows like fingers counting down invisible seconds. Inside, the prosecutor concluded his presentation. Your Honor, the state rests on the credibility of Officer Brooks. The sentence echoed through the room. Credibility. It was the foundation beneath everything they had built. The judge slowly nodded before turning toward the defense table. "Ms. Carter," he said, "your opportunity to respond will begin shortly." The courtroom became completely silent. Daniel allowed himself one final smile. He believed the hardest questions had already been answered. He believed every lie had successfully become part of the official record. He never realized that somewhere beyond the courtroom walls, another record already existed. One that had never depended on his version of events. One that had been quietly collecting the truth long before he ever raised his hand and swore to tell it. The courtroom remained motionless after the judge announced that the defense could begin preparing its response. No one rushed to speak. No one expected anything dramatic to happen. In fact, most people believed they had already witnessed the most important part of the trial. Officer Daniel Brooks certainly believed that. He leaned back in his chair, quietly adjusting the cuff of his uniform as though the afternoon had become little more than a formality. The confidence in his face no longer came from hope. It came from certainty. Across the room, Vanessa Carter slowly organized the documents resting in front of her. Not dozens of folders. Not towering stacks of paperwork. Only a thin file. She handled each page with extraordinary care, almost as though the order mattered more than the volume. Because sometimes one verified fact is more powerful than 1,000 confident lies. The spectators exchanged whispers. That's all she brought? How is she supposed to answer everything with one folder? Another voice quietly replied, maybe she's finally realized she can't win. Vanessa heard them. She simply continued arranging the papers. Imagine standing alone while an entire room quietly decides your future before you've spoken a single word. Imagine knowing that everyone mistakes preparation for weakness simply because it isn't loud. The truth rarely announces itself. It waits. Daniel glanced toward her one more time. He noticed the thin file. He smiled. For months he had watched internal investigations disappear under missing paperwork, incomplete statements, and forgotten evidence. He understood bureaucracy better than almost anyone. A small file meant a small case. Or so he believed. The judge reviewed several notes. Before addressing the courtroom. Before the defense proceeds, does either party wish to submit additional evidence? The prosecutor immediately stood. No additional evidence from the state, Your Honor. He sounded relaxed. Confident. Certain. The judge turned toward the defense. Ms. Carter. Vanessa rose slowly. Every eye followed her. She remained silent for several seconds, allowing the room to settle into complete stillness before speaking. Not yet, Your Honor. Just 3 words. Nothing more. The prosecutor looked almost amused. Daniel exchanged another confident glance with one of the officers seated behind him. They interpreted restraint as hesitation. They confused patience with defeat. Vanessa sat back down. Her attorney leaned closer. If we're holding something, he whispered, this is the moment. She answered calmly. No. Not yet. He stared at her. They've finished presenting their story. They haven't finished exposing it. Those words lingered in his mind. Across the courtroom, the court reporter continued recording every exchange with mechanical precision. Keys clicked. Pages advanced. Time moved forward. Outside, rain continued falling against the courthouse windows, washing streaks across the glass until the city beyond looked almost invisible. Inside, another kind of storm was quietly building. Near the clerk's desk, the sealed envelope remained unopened. The judge occasionally glanced toward it, then back toward his notes. The prosecutor noticed nothing unusual. Daniel noticed even less. He had become focused on the verdict he believed was approaching. Success has a dangerous habit. It narrows vision. The bailiff stepped toward the bench and quietly whispered something into the judge's ear. The judge gave only the slightest nod. No explanation followed. Most people overlooked the exchange. Vanessa didn't. Neither did the two silent observers seated in the final row. One of them made another brief note. The other checked the time. Daniel remained completely unaware that people in the room were no longer studying Vanessa. They were studying him. Every answer he had given under oath. Every timeline he had confirmed. Every denial he had confidently repeated. One by one, his own statements were quietly becoming the framework against which something far larger would soon be measured. He still believed he was the witness. He had no idea he was slowly becoming the subject. The courtroom clock ticked with quiet precision, each second sounding louder than the last. Outside, the rain had begun to fade, leaving thin streams of water sliding down the courthouse windows. The storm was moving on. Inside, another storm had only just begun. Judge Eleanor Whitmore looked down from the bench, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the documents before her. She had presided over hundreds of trials, and experience had taught her that the loudest arguments were rarely the strongest ones. Sometimes the most important truth arrived without raising its voice. She looked toward the defense table. "Ms. Carter," she said calmly, "the court will now hear your response." Every head turned. The spectators leaned forward. Pens hovered over notepads. Camera lenses quietly adjusted. For the first time since the trial had begun, Vanessa Carter rose without hesitation. She buttoned her charcoal jacket with slow, deliberate movements before stepping away from the defense table. Her footsteps echoed softly across the polished wooden floor, each one measured, each one unhurried. Daniel Brooks watched with quiet amusement. He expected emotion. He expected desperation. He expected a last attempt to rescue a collapsing case. Instead, Vanessa carried only the same thin folder she had organized all afternoon. Nothing else. Imagine believing you've already won. Imagine thinking every question has already been answered. Imagine never realizing the real examination hasn't even started. Vanessa stopped several feet from the witness stand. She did not immediately address the judge. She looked instead toward the jury. Not to persuade them. To acknowledge them. Then she spoke. Officer Brooks testified today that every statement he made under oath was completely accurate. Her voice was calm. Clear. Steady enough that every word carried effortlessly across the courtroom. The prosecutor immediately nodded. That is correct. Vanessa simply accepted the answer. She turned one page inside her folder. Nothing dramatic. No stack of photographs. No emotional display. Only a single sheet resting beneath her fingertips. Daniel folded his arms. His confidence remained untouched. He had survived internal complaints before. He had answered difficult questions before. He believed this would be no different. Vanessa looked toward him for only a moment. Officer Brooks also testified that he had no personal motive, no discriminatory intent, and no reason to alter his report. Again the prosecutor answered. Correct. Vanessa nodded once. Thank you. That was all. The simplicity of her questions puzzled several jurors. Even her own attorney seemed uncertain where she was leading the conversation. Across the room, the two silent observers exchanged another brief glance before returning to their notebooks. Neither interrupted. Neither reacted. They simply continued documenting every answer. The judge leaned forward slightly. Ms. Carter, she asked, are you establishing a foundation? Yes, Your Honor. The answer came instantly. No explanation followed. Daniel shifted in his chair for the first time that afternoon. Only slightly. Barely enough for anyone else to notice. But Vanessa noticed. She noticed because she had spent months studying far smaller changes than that. A tightened jaw. A restless hand. A confident witness beginning to wonder why the questions felt so easy. Truth has an unusual way of approaching. It doesn't always arrive through confrontation. Sometimes it arrives through agreement. One statement at a time. One confirmation at a time. One oath at a time. Vanessa gently closed the folder without revealing another page. I have no further questions at this moment, Your Honor. The courtroom fell silent again. The prosecutor looked almost relieved. Daniel allowed himself another quiet smile. He believed she had accomplished nothing. He believed she had wasted her opportunity. What neither of them understood was that every answer Daniel had repeated moments earlier had now been confirmed a second time, voluntarily, in open court. And somewhere beyond the courtroom doors, those sworn confirmations were about to be compared with evidence gathered long before this trial ever began. For the first time that day, the trap was no longer being built. It had quietly been locked. The silence after Vanessa Carter returned to her seat was unlike anything the courtroom had experienced that day. It was no longer the silence of confidence. It was the silence of uncertainty. Judge Eleanor Whitmore glanced from the defense table to the prosecution, then toward the clerk beside the bench. "Bring me the sealed submission," she said quietly. The bailiff stepped forward without hesitation. For the first time all afternoon, Daniel Brooks looked away from Vanessa and toward the envelope that had rested unnoticed on the clerk's desk for hours. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Small. Uncomfortable. He couldn't explain why. The envelope was placed carefully before the judge. She broke the seal without comment. No dramatic announcement. No theatrical pause. Only the soft sound of paper unfolding inside a room where every person seemed to stop breathing at once. Daniel tried to read her expression. He couldn't. Years of standing before judges had taught him to recognize frustration, approval, annoyance, and sympathy. This expression was different. It was concentration. The judge slowly reviewed the first page. Then the second. Then another. She stopped briefly, adjusted her glasses, and continued reading. The prosecutor shifted uneasily. "Your Honor." She raised one hand without looking up. "One moment." The interruption was polite. "Final. Imagine believing the entire courtroom belongs to you. Imagine watching the person with the greatest authority suddenly become interested in something you never expected to exist. Imagine realizing that the story is no longer moving according to your script." Daniel's fingers tightened around the edge of the defense table. Only slightly. Enough for his knuckles to lose their color. Across the room, Vanessa remained perfectly composed. She never looked toward the documents. She already knew what they contained. Months earlier, she had watched investigators organize every interview, every forensic review, every authenticated recording, and every sworn statement into carefully indexed files. Nothing inside that envelope had been rushed. Nothing depended on emotion. Everything depended on verification. The judge finally looked up. "Counsel," she said to the prosecutor, "when exactly was this material disclosed to your office?" The prosecutor blinked. "I'm not certain which material Your Honor is referring to." "The supplemental federal submission." A quiet murmur spread through the gallery. Federal? Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. Federal submissions did not simply appear in ordinary hearings. Not without reason. Not without authorization. The prosecutor hurriedly reviewed his own folder. "I don't believe I've received." "You acknowledged receipt yesterday afternoon," the judge replied calmly, tapping the signed transmittal page attached to the file. His face changed. Only for an instant. But it changed. He searched through his paperwork more aggressively now, finally locating a sealed packet that had remained unopened beneath several trial exhibits. His confidence faded. Vanessa watched without satisfaction. Without anger. She had seen this moment before. The exact instant when certainty begins collapsing under the weight of overlooked facts. The two observers seated in the final row quietly stood. Neither spoke. Neither approached the witness stand. They simply moved toward opposite sides of the courtroom, their movements calm and deliberate, as though they had rehearsed this moment many times. Daniel noticed them for the first time. They weren't reporters. They weren't deputies assigned to courtroom security. They carried themselves differently. Professional. Disciplined. Patient. One briefly checked the time before giving the smallest nod toward the other. Vanessa lowered her eyes for a moment. Not because she was nervous. Because the waiting was finally ending. The investigation that had begun months before this trial was no longer hidden behind confidential files and sealed interviews. Its shadow had entered the courtroom. Daniel Brooks still believed he understood the case being argued before the judge. He still believed this hearing was about defending his actions on one difficult day. He had not yet realized that the courtroom itself had quietly become the final stage of an investigation that had never been centered on Vanessa Carter at all. It had always been centered on him. And within moments, the reason why would no longer remain a secret. The courtroom no longer felt like the same room that had welcomed Officer Daniel Brooks only a few hours earlier. The polished wood, the high ceiling, the rows of silent spectators, they were all unchanged. Yet something invisible had shifted. Confidence had left the room. Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully placed the federal file on the bench before lifting her eyes toward Vanessa Carter. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice measured, "the court would like clarification regarding the origin of these materials." Vanessa stood. This time, there was no hesitation. No pause. No uncertainty. She walked toward the center of the courtroom carrying nothing but the same thin folder she had held since the hearing began. Daniel watched her approach. His heartbeat had become impossible to ignore. For the first time all day, he wasn't thinking about winning. He was thinking about what he didn't know. Imagine spending months believing you controlled every piece of the board. Imagine discovering there was another game being played above yours. One where every move you made had already been anticipated. Vanessa stopped several feet from the witness stand. She faced the judge before calmly speaking. "Your Honor, the documents before the court were obtained during a lawful federal investigation conducted over several months." The word federal echoed through the courtroom once again. This time, nobody whispered. Nobody moved. Even the prosecutor remained silent. Judge Whitmore nodded. "And your connection to that investigation?" Vanessa looked briefly toward Daniel Brooks. He expected anger. He expected revenge. Instead, he found only quiet professionalism. "My connection," she replied, "is that I was assigned to it." Daniel frowned. "Assigned? Assigned by whom?" The judge continued. "In what capacity?" Vanessa reached inside her jacket. The movement was slow enough that every eye followed her hand. She removed a leather credential wallet and placed it carefully on the evidence table. The bailiff picked it up and handed it to the judge. The courtroom became perfectly still. Judge Whitmore opened it. Her expression remained controlled, but there was no mistaking the significance of what she was reading. She closed the credential, looked directly at Vanessa, and gave a small nod. "Thank you, Special Agent Carter." The words landed like thunder. A collective gasp spread through the gallery. One reporter nearly dropped his notebook. Another immediately reached for his phone. Daniel Brooks felt the color drain from his face. Special Agent? FBI? His mind raced backward through every conversation. Every report. Every interview. Every insult. Every lie he had spoken under oath while looking directly into the eyes of the woman he believed was simply another civilian. Across the room, the two silent observers finally stepped forward. One produced federal identification. The other quietly handed a sealed packet to the bailiff. Neither raised their voice. Neither needed to. Their presence explained everything. Vanessa spoke again, her tone unchanged. Officer Brooks testified today that every statement in his incident report was truthful. She paused. He also confirmed that testimony under oath before this court. Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in years, words abandoned him. Because he finally understood what Vanessa had known from the very beginning. This hearing had never been designed to trap him with accusations. It had been designed to let him repeat his own version of events voluntarily, publicly, and under oath. Every denial. Every timeline. Every statement. Recorded. Confirmed. Authenticated. Vanessa had never needed him to confess. She had only needed him to choose his lie one final time. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Whitmore carefully closed the federal credential and placed it beside the investigation file. The balance of power had shifted completely. Only hours earlier, Daniel Brooks believed he was testifying against a black woman. Now he understood the truth. He had spent the entire day giving sworn testimony in front of the very FBI special agent who had been investigating him all along. No one spoke. The silence that filled courtroom 4 carried more weight than any closing argument ever could. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on Officer Daniel Brooks, whose confidence had disappeared as completely as the smile he had worn only minutes earlier. The polished badge on his uniform suddenly seemed much smaller. Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully placed both hands on the bench before looking across the courtroom. "The record will reflect," she said calmly, "that Special Agent Vanessa Carter has identified herself and that her federal credentials have been verified by this court." Every word echoed through the room. Official. Permanent. Irreversible. Daniel swallowed hard. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but Daniel barely heard the words. His own testimony replayed inside his mind. Every denial. Every promise. Every statement he had sworn was true. He had repeated them all willingly. Imagine realizing that the greatest evidence against you isn't hidden in someone else's file. Imagine discovering it came from your own voice. The judge continued. The court has also received notice that the submitted federal materials relate to an ongoing public corruption investigation. The court will not discuss confidential details in open session. However, the existence of that investigation materially affects today's proceedings. A murmur spread through the gallery. Reporters hurried to write every sentence. The prosecutor lowered his eyes, understanding that the hearing had become something entirely different from the case he believed he was presenting. Vanessa remained exactly where she stood. She did not celebrate. She did not smile. Justice, she had learned long ago, was never about humiliation. It was about accountability. The two federal investigators quietly approached the center aisle. One addressed the judge with respectful professionalism. "Your Honor, we request permission to preserve today's sworn testimony as part of the investigative record." "So ordered," Judge Whitmore replied. The sound of her gavel striking the bench seemed louder than the thunder that had rolled outside earlier that afternoon. Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time, he understood why Vanessa had never argued. Why she had never interrupted. Why she had allowed him to speak. She had not been waiting for him to make a mistake. She had been waiting for him to make a choice. And he had chosen to repeat every falsehood under oath. One after another. Vanessa finally looked toward him. Her voice remained calm. "Officer Brooks, everyone deserves fairness." She paused. "So does every investigation." There was no anger in her words. Only truth. The courtroom doors slowly opened as afternoon sunlight finally broke through the passing storm, filling the room with a warm light that had been absent all day. The rain had stopped. Outside, people continued walking through the city, unaware that inside one ordinary courtroom, the direction of an entire case had changed. The judge announced that the hearing would be continued pending further proceedings consistent with the newly presented information. Court officers began guiding the spectators toward the exits. Reporters rushed into the hallway. Jurors quietly reflected on everything they had witnessed. Daniel remained seated. His badge had not vanished. His uniform had not changed. But the certainty that once protected him was gone. Vanessa picked up her thin folder. The same folder everyone had underestimated. She nodded respectfully to the judge before walking toward the courtroom doors without looking back. She did not need applause. She did not need revenge. The truth had already done what anger never could. As the heavy courtroom doors closed behind her, only one thought remained hanging in the silent room. A badge can command authority. An oath can demand trust. But when truth finally arrives, neither power nor prejudice can stand in its way. Because justice is never defined by the loudest voice. It is defined by the courage to let the truth speak last.